In this section, I'm going to teach you my tips on how to execute and really kill the behavioral interview. First, we're going to discuss the format of your story. So a lot of people use the dig method, the star method. If you don't know what those are, we're not using them because just throw them out the window. I was practicing a ton with a bunch of my friends, and what I noticed is that when they were telling these stories and using these methods, they told them the same way every time. And even though that they were different stories, they sounded the same because they all had identical structures, and it was so boring. The only thing that I want you to include in your story is a beginning, a middle, an end. Tell the story, start it off with the attention grabber. Oh, let me tell you about the time when. For example, let me tell you about the time when I lost $4,000. That's a great beginning. The interviewer's like, what? Like, how did you lose $4,000? We just want to get their attention. Get that attention grabber in the end. That little nugget that gets them and pulls them in. That's the beginning. Then you want to kind of lay the landscape. Just talk about the beginning details. When I was a freshman, I worked for XYZ company. That's the beginning of the story. The middle is really going to be talk about leading up to the conflict, what the conflict was, and how you overcame it. The middle of the story shouldn't be long. There should be flows to it. And then the end, the conclusion, the summary, what you did, what ended up happening. As long as you have a beginning, a middle, an end, and that attention grabber in the beginning, and you kind of just think about it as those three main parts, you're going to do great. Don't stress too much about the digs. Just don't stress too much about the star. We just want to focus on telling a really great story. There's no format to telling a story except having a beginning, a middle, and end. But that's what we're focusing on. We're focusing on a story, not a structure to answer an interview question. 2, I want you to use people's names. I think people overestimate the power of just using names because it makes the story real. It brings it to life. You want your characters in your story, as we talked about, beginning, middle, end, to have characters. For example, one of the stories I like to tell is when I had a conflict with a coworker, and I could be like, and I had this conflict with this coworker, and he was always doing this and this. But instead, I had the conflict with this coworker. His name was Yeltsin. I then put a name to the character in the story, and that's how you tell good stories. Your stories have characters. Imagine if you watched a movie and none of the characters had names. It wouldn't be as powerful. So include names in your stories. 3, this is similar to using names, but I want you to use exact numbers. If you're saying you lost money, give them a number. Again, it goes on that same factor as names where it just helps you to create more of a real, impactful story. Number 4, this again goes along with names and exact numbers, but be specific as possible. Say locations, say companies, say teams. General stories that are ambiguous don't drive emotion. They don't connect with your interviewer. Being specific as possible is what's going to help to create a unique, engaging story. 5, show some emotion when you're telling the story. When you're excited, if you had a success, like you started a business and sold it, be excited. That's a great story. If you're a failure, show some regret, show some sadness about the story. It wasn't a happy experience. You want to convey the emotions of your story in the way you're telling it. There's one time when I was a freshman, I actually lost $4,000 fall semester my freshman year trying to dropship hoverboards, and it was just a really bad experience. My company was super successful. I ended up growing the revenue, and I actually ended up selling it going into my senior year of college. Do you see that? I should convey the emotions of the story. If I just went, I sold my business. That was cool. I lost $4,000. That was also cool. You don't want to speak monotone, and you want to show the emotions that your stories are driving. This is going to help your interviewer feel those emotions, and again, just help you tell a better story. I want you to have a summary at the end of your story to be able to really wrap it up, wrap up the conclusion, the main takeaways. For example, if you told your story, one of the stories I tell is about how I started I came to freshman year wanting to work in California. I organized a startup career fair, got my internship with Juicero, ended up working for Juicero. At the end, I would always say, In the end, I ended up reaching my goal of having an internship in California, and I was the second intern that Juicero ever had. That just wraps up the story, shows my interviewer that I set my goal, reached it, ended up interning with Juicero. Make sure you have that summary at the end so your interviewer is aware of the key points that you want them to take away and what the outcome of that story was. Next is, I want your stories to have some variance. Like I talked about earlier, when I was doing practice interviews, my friends, they were using these structured interview methods for behavioral interviews. All their stories were the same. Same intonation, same structure, same parts. Literally couldn't even tell the difference except the words they were speaking. Stories are meant to connect with people. So I want your stories to have some variance. If you're telling a sad story, be sad. If you're telling a happy story, be excited. Have the lengths of the story different. If every single story is exactly 3 minutes, your interviewer is going to subconsciously notice, and it's just going to become boring. You want there to be variance to keep your interviewer on your toes. I like to think of these as not interview questions, but stories. And stories are not all the same. You want them to be unique. So keep every time all of your interview questions, all of your interview answers unique in that way that they're all special for the interviewer. Don't keep them all exactly the same. Finally, give alternatives in your stories. You should usually stick to 3, just because that's a number that a lot of people like and gravitate towards, and 2 might come off as incomplete. But showing that you have alternative options in a situation and why you chose one over the other is a great way on telling a complete story. An example of this would be, when I was working with my coworker Yeltsin, we had a lot of issues together, and there was really 3 things I could have done. I could have done X, I could have done Y, and I could have done Z. Ultimately, I decided to go with Y because of this. And being able to show why you made the decision really helps to tell that complete story and give your interviewer a full picture of what was going on in the circumstances. This is a great part to put in the middle of your story. Another pro tip to add on to this that I wouldn't say is required or necessary in any way, but to become a better communicator, one thing that really brings you to life as a speaker and makes the story more enjoyable, using hand motions. And just using your hands to communicate different things, simple as I could have done X, Y, or Z, is just a great way to keep the interviewer engaged. They're not just looking at you sitting there with your arms crossed or wherever they are. You don't have to do this. Don't make it unnatural. I naturally speak with my hands. It's just something that you can incorporate in your story.